Today on the Solar Podcast, Accelerating the Midwest Energy Transition. My guest today needs no introduction, the president of Generate Capital, co-host of the Energy Gang podcast, author of Creating Climate Wealth, and the founder of SunEdison. Welcome to the show, Jigar Shah.
Thanks. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful. It's a heady day. I really appreciate you coming on the show. This is a big day for the Solar Podcast.
Well, thanks. I'm glad to be a part of it.
Before we get into the conversation, I'd like to make a few announcements. As many of our listeners know, we host these live events on a monthly basis here at Continental Energy Solutions. You can find all of our upcoming events at cesnrg.com/podcast. Today's event, of course, Jigar Shah. Later this month, we have Kimberly Centera with TerraPro Solutions coming on the show. TerraPro is a consultancy that specializes in helping wind and solar developers de-risk their projects on the front end, very much around land acquisition. And then in November, PVEL's coming back on the show with Michael Mills-Price. He is the head of inverters and storage for PVEL. We're going to be talking about PV inverter and battery storage scorecard. PVEL has a great testing methodology and reporting for the industry, so check that out. You know, one of the memes in our interactions in the run up to this was the fact that you are an Illinois native, and so I wanted to give you a warm Illinois welcome and let you know that a friend of yours from the U of I, Ty Newell, says hello.
Ty is amazing.
I've become good friends with Ty over the years, and I worked for a couple of years at the U of I. That's what brought me to Champaign-Urbana. And then I had the good fortune to get pulled into solar in 2016, and now I work for a contractor up in Chicago. So we have a healthy group of people on the show, and I want to encourage our listeners to put questions into the Q&A, and we will do our best to address those. And I thought, Jigar, we could start with a little bit of your roots, though, here in Illinois. Tell us what it was like to grow up in Sterling.
Yeah, my dad came over to the country in 1973 and did his residency in Oak Lawn, Illinois, outside of Chicago. And then after he finished, we moved out to Sterling. And it was a great place to grow up. I mean, rural town. It was, we had the carcass of the steel mill. It was the 7th largest steel mill in the country at one point, and was on the decline when we moved there in 1983. And I guess probably 1981 actually was when we moved there. And finally shut down for good when I was in high school in the early 90s. But yeah, no, it was a great place to grow up. The Dillon family, who owned the steel mill, was the largest benefactor in the town, and made sure that the schools were well funded, and the Park District had nice tennis courts and all those things.
And then you became a mechanical engineer briefly at the University of Illinois.
That's right.
Went on to work in the wind industry right out of college, and then got into solar pretty quickly.
That's right.
And then started SunEdison, which was a brazen move in what, 2003?
That's right.
So you have now 17 years of solar entrepreneurship under your belt, and the industry, of course, is on fire globally. The industry is in fits and starts on fire here in the Midwest, and I want to talk about that and see. I'm always curious what people from the coasts, where the solar markets are much more mature. You're there in Maryland, New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, the Carolinas, and then of course California, the big dog, and then some others in the Southwest, with Texas coming on so strong now. But how do you perceive what's going on in the Midwest with solar, wind, and storage?
Yeah, I think it's in general not well thought out. My sense is they feel largely left behind. And when you have these moments where the nuclear power plants need subsidies, they say, great, let's, force, ComEd, Exelon to agree to a bunch of these renewable energy programs, which they had agreed to back in 2008, 2009, but they never actually implemented well. And let's force them to implement it, right? And so from that perspective, I'd say, we did a good job, but I think that the part that I get frustrated by in the Midwest is that, the Midwest is filled with towns like Sterling, Illinois, that have been hollowed out by manufacturing facilities that went under in the 80s and 90s. And, they have towns that basically have had 20% unemployment for as long as, we've known about it, right? Because people don't want to move. And you could imagine that what we're talking about here could actually bring, good job creation and economic development to these towns, but it's not done in a way that is actually, well coordinated.
Is there such a thing as a smooth transition, though? We have this expression, the solar coaster, and it's a well-deserved expression, seemingly. It's not a happy expression, in my opinion. And here in Illinois, for example, we've spent the last 3 years funding training programs, getting more installers into the industry, more electricians, and across the board, more professionals, right? And the developers have moved in en masse because of the community solar market primarily, but also because of the DG rooftop market. And now everything except residential is on pause. The recs are dried up momentarily. We don't know, will it be a 2-year pause or a 4-year pause? There's just so much uncertainty. And so I tell young professionals, look, you have to be flexible and willing to move and go where the markets go.
Yeah, but and so that's on the solar roller coaster ride for contractors and developers, right? But remember, right? I grew up in a town, that basically got decimated. The amount of free money available to Sterling, Illinois is gargantuan. The sister city across the river is Rock Falls. They have their own municipal utility. So they actually have a legal designation that lets them do a lot of weird and creative things, right? So Skip Grow over there in Sterling, Illinois, the mayor, has the ability to raise $100 million if he wanted to at 2% interest rates from the government programs he has access to. Separately, he's pulled down $20 million for, for the community college nearby to retrain a lot of the people who lost their jobs at the steel mill, right? And all of that money is a pittance compared to the amount of solar that could be installed in that area. You could do $1 billion of solar in Whiteside County and not bat an eye, and you could make it all cost effective without FIJA or without any of the other stuff that's going on there, but you need leadership. You don't have leadership from the mayors of those towns. You don't have leadership from their elected officials going into the House and Senate, right? And so the challenge that we have is that we literally are experiencing this revolution. And unless a top-down program from the state of Illinois, which then allows you and your colleagues to basically go to Whiteside County and say, hey, we want to do this. And they say, well, as long as you have a deal that you cut with a local farmer, right, we're happy to, streamline a permit through the process and get you the approvals that you need. But we're not going to do anything to give you access to the 2% interest financing that we have unlimited access to through the U.S. Department of Agriculture, right? Because frankly, we're not thinking about it that way. We're not thinking about economic development. We're waiting and praying for, somebody to come by our town and say they're going to restart the steel mill.
But if you're the mayor of Sterling, you don't know anything about renewable energy, really. You've seen the wind farms come in starting in 2009, and now you may see some community solar arrays around, but there's only, 111 of those so there's one per county basically in Illinois, 1.1 per county. And so I think, well, if you were mayor, how do you leverage the growth of the renewables industry? Because those people need more information.
Right, but it's not because they don't have access to that information, right? I've contacted Skip a number of times. My high school class, right? The vast majority of the people who graduate from high school with me still live in Whitehead County, right? I'm on Facebook posts with them. They all know the success that I've had. And I'm a, generous benefactor to Sterling High School Foundation. I talk to them all the time and say, here's the new program. This is Hungry Hungry Hippos. You should make sure that you get more than your fair share of the spoils of this. And you can, because you have somebody in your camp, me, that's happy to give you unlimited amounts of free advice to get this done. They don't have an interest, right? And so part of my concern is that we in the Midwest, right, are not actually holding our elected officials to a high enough standard. What we're saying to them is that they're uneducated, that they don't have passion for these things, right? And what that leads to is them falling and their communities falling farther behind. Remember, many of these towns that I grew up in is where all the opioid crises exist, because they've been persistently at 20% unemployment rates. People are like, what do I do with myself now that I don't have a good paying job? And they've fallen prey to opioid addiction, all sorts of things, right? And so there are real reasons for us to care about economic development in these towns, right? And it frustrates me because many of us grew up and graduated from high school in these towns, not just me. Many of us on the East Coast or West Coast grew up in these towns. And all of us want the towns that we grew up in to show more leadership. But I think that it is not fair to say that we didn't do our part. I think it is more fair to say that they didn't do their part, and that when these opportunities were presented to them, they didn't rise to the occasion.
Well, the opportunity isn't over, right? It's ongoing. And I guess I am curious, if you were mayor of Sterling, what kind of projects would you be trying to spur in that region?
Well, for instance, the USDA has a program called the REAP program, REAP, for these
Familiar.
municipal utilities, right, of which Rock Falls is one of them. But there are many, many others in the state of Illinois and throughout the Midwest that have this designation. They have access to USDA guaranteed money, right? If they had a power purchase agreement from Rock Falls Municipal Utility, a credit guarantee from the USDA REAP program, they could build $400 million of solar in their sleep and supply all of the power that Rock Falls needs for its community and export it to neighboring communities like Sterling and other places, right? I would do that the next day, right? And then on top of that, you could then pair it up with battery storage and provide battery storage to a lot of these markets, whether it's the MISO market, which I think Sterling falls into, or whether it's the PJM market, which Chicago falls into. And so these programs are available, and what it requires is is a public-private partnership, which frankly, we don't do that well in this country. I mean, I would say the Canadians do it better, but whether it's East Coast, West Coast, or the Midwest, we don't do public-private partnerships well. And so, but that's what it takes, right? You transfer all of the performance risk onto the private sector provider, and you get access to all this cheap capital through the public sector partner, and you partner together. And if the performance is great, well, the private sector partner makes a ton of money. And if the performance is terrible, well, the private sector partner takes it on the chin, but the public sector is protected in either case.
Yeah. Well, to their credit, I do want to give a shout out to the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus. They have a program called the Greenest Region Compact, getting mayors to sign on to sustainability goals. I'm just going to share my screen real quick. It's an impressive cluster of towns and cities that they have gotten to sign on. And this program has some real chops. So it's not all bad news. I'm not saying that the Rust Belt in the Midwest isn't in a crisis. It absolutely is. And of course, now that's even more so because of COVID.
No, and I think, Tim, I think this chart makes my case for me, right? The vast majority of these mayors are in places where land values are going up, right? The only place where that's not true is in polo, which, you know, I used to play against in my high school athletic sports. In polo, land prices are not going up there. And those are the places where, you know, they can confidently, you know, put technology on that land for 20 years and not worry about it. Remember, the average Illinois corn farmer has made less than $75 an acre of profits for the last 7 years growing corn, right? We're paying an average of $200 an acre for the rental payments that we're paying to these farmers, right? And so, like, part of I think what we need to talk through is the sheer amount of economic development that we can provide to these towns is ginormous. And I wish you could get a lot more mayors like the mayor of Polo into this place where, you know, I mean, as you know, Illinois is this weird place. It's this long, skinny state. And everyone thinks about Chicago, but it actually, the bottom part of Illinois is sort of in the South. And most of the state is, you know, made up of land that, you know, isn't going up in value, right? And so they can make economic development choices with that land for 20 years. And remember, less than 2% of the farmland in Illinois, the worst part of it, right, the parts that are least productive, is what's needed to power the entire state of Illinois.
Yeah, we're rich in land. And I mean, the nature of solar development is that the developers are going to opt for the path of least resistance. You know, that subprime farm ground that you're referring to isn't always near a substation. And, you know, but there was overwhelming demand for those community solar projects from a developer's perspective. And of course, they got leases from all these landowners. Well, there's a queue of over 700 projects, right, that didn't win RECs in the lottery. They're just sitting there incubating and going nowhere fast. So land isn't an issue. It's a combination of willpower and good public-private partnerships. I mean, at least we now have a governor who's putting a stake in the ground for 100% RPS by 2050. The Pritzker administration issued a report in August, and they're trying to clamp down on the utilities because, of course, you know about the corruption there.
Well, I don't know that it was corruption as much as it was, you know, they didn't report it to the FBI fast enough. You know, Speaker Madigan asked for one of his friends to get on the board of Exelon, and they should have gone immediately to the FBI instead of trying to work out a deal with Speaker Madigan.
Okay, well, those are the kindest words I've heard in the recent past about the situation.
No, but I just think that it's important for us to get outraged when outrage is warranted and not when it's not, right? First Energy spent $60 million paying off legislators to get a bill passed, right? Arizona Public Service has been paying off regulators on a regular basis because they're elected, right? I mean, there's a lot of dark money. Consumers Energy in Michigan, you know, did some really crazy things, right? And so, like, it's one of those things where I think that, I beat up Exelon a lot, right? Because I think they deserve it. I think this one, you know, I think the goal for me with Exelon is to figure out how to save these nuclear plants because clean energy matters, and I think climate matters, and figure out how we decarbonize the rest of the state in 10 years.
Yeah, well, I mean, nuclear is alive and well in Illinois, and FIJA bailed out Clinton and Quad Cities to the tune of $200 million a year, which is the amount of REC money that went into solar. And of course, now they're lobbying hard to expand that fleet of old nuclear plants that they want to prop up. I would rather see next generation nuclear take off. I mean, these plants are, many of them, you know, going on high 30s, 40 years old.
Which is young for a nuclear plant, right? Byron is probably the newest nuclear plant we built in the United States outside of the TVA reactors. And, you know, that came about when I was living there. It was like 84, I think, is when it came online. Byron's probably got 15 to 20 years left on that still.
Mhm.
So do most of the other plants here in Midwest. I think we all should be committed to making sure that those plants run for as long as the Nuclear Regulatory Commission says is it's safe to run them. I think separately, we've got to figure out, how to transition the state, right, and attract all these economic development dollars. Remember, for every dollar that we invest in clean energy, the federal government's providing 30 cents of tax credits, right? And so that's matching dollars, right? And so, like, my sense is that we, for whatever reason, have not been able to co-opt the nuclear folks into our coalition, mainly because it's just Exelon, as opposed to being able to, as opposed to like where we are now, where it's sort of renewable energy versus nuclear, which that makes no sense to me in the state. Like the largest proportion of clean energy in the Midwest right now is from nuclear plants. We should keep them all going through their useful life and build a crapload of solar, wind, biomass, geothermal, hydro, et cetera.
Yeah. And clearly the industry, the renewable energy industry, was willing to make that trade-off, and that was baked into FEJA. Unfortunately, FEJA is not adequate. FEJA is not going to get us to 25% by 2025. And it's so easy. I'm very curious what you think about this. It's one thing to chart a course to say 25% or 100%, but getting that across the finish line is so easy to derail. And honestly, I think it was a poison pill that the rec money was drying up so quickly. I mean, we're only talking about 3,000 megawatts of solar and 1,000 megawatts of wind, and yet now it's stalled.
Well, I mean, I would say that when you think about how much solar is being deployed right now into Kentucky, right, or into Arkansas, or into these other markets, solar and wind today can be cost effective without any subsidies in the Midwest. Maybe not in Illinois for wind power, because Illinois doesn't have great wind, right? For as much as people call Chicago the Windy City, it's not that windy. And so you have a lot more wind in Iowa, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota. So what you really want to do with wind is to build transmission lines from that part of the grid, which was, part of the SEAM study, et cetera, into Illinois, to bring a lot of that clean wind energy into the state. I think from a solar perspective, big solar farms in Illinois can be cost effective today. You could generate power for less than 3 cents a kilowatt hour from, large 500 megawatt, 300 megawatt solar farms in Illinois today. So I think we can make it work. The biggest problem that we have is we have hostile utilities with Exelon and Ameren. And the question becomes is how do we make them less hostile? How do we figure out how to create a program that, yes, accomplishes a lot of the environmental and economic justice issues that we want to do with community solar, with some of the other programs that are mandating the training of the folks who've been left behind within the state to get involved in this new industry. So I think all of those programs should be preserved, and they don't frankly cost that much. But if you're going to get to 25%, most of that's going to be projects that get subsidized not through the power, but get subsidized through the infrastructure. So you're basically paying off ComEd and Ameren by saying that instead of forcing the solar and wind industry to pay for interconnection, for instance, that the ratepayers pay for interconnection. And you basically just have that be rate-based by Ameren and ComEd. And that, I think, can be done fairly easily, and I think they would be happy to do that. But we haven't had that conversation. But I think the infrastructure cost is what they should be paid through rate base. And then the rest of the solar and wind would be a lot cheaper.
And we are getting 600 plus megawatts of utility scale solar now. Some of those projects are under construction. There's a big project near Carbondale that's under construction. Acciona is building a 120 megawatt project up in northern Illinois. Invenergy has several 200 plus megawatts. Baywa has a 150 megawatt project in my backyard here in Champaign County. So We do have a question from Jody, which is relevant to this. Is anything being done to develop coordination at the state level to promote this transition? For example, is it addressed in the government's work group? I think she's referring to the governor's working group. And I don't know that you'll be able to address that specifically, but she also touches on the Prairie State coal plant issue, right? Where Prairie State is in a contract with with IMEA, right? This network of co-ops, and it's a death grip. The co-ops are hostile to renewable energy. They're on the hook for this long-term coal contract, which is uneconomical. I've heard business owners say point blank, we're thinking of leaving, and these are communities like Naperville that are in this network of co-ops. What do you say to that?
They're crazy. I mean, this is what I'm saying. Like, remember Ken Bone, the red sweater guy, is the guy I think worked at Prairie State coal plant, right? That coal plant, when it was brought online, lost money the next day. So all these rural co-ops put money into the plant. The plant started losing money the next day because the way that plant operates is they sell all their power basically into MISO. And then, like they provide dividends out to their investors. And because the plant loses money, they don't get enough money from the wholesale power prices to even pay for the coal or the operations. All of their investors actually have to put more money in every year. It's literally the worst investment in history. And guess what these rural co-ops can do? They have unlimited amounts of money they can borrow at 2% from the federal government to, for instance, provide everyone in their community with broadband. They have unlimited amounts of money from the federal government to provide everyone in their territory, electrify everything, right? And Naperville is not rural, right? I mean, my parents live in Aurora, but when you think about what Naperville could do with the new FERC order 2222, right? If Naperville provided all of their residents with DER-enabled refrigerators and water heaters and Nest thermostats, right, and paid for it all with 2% interest money, they would literally be able to bid all that capacity into the market and get paid and give everyone free appliances. And that's something uniquely that a rural co-op can do, right? That no one else can do. It's shocking to me how uneducated these co-ops are. And we let them get away with it. We're like, they're just country bumpkins, right? Naperville is not a country bumpkin place, right? I mean, Naperville, I expect more from Naperville and their citizens. I mean, hell, I think it's 50% Indian people. And it's just like the dumbest thing ever. And I'm tired of letting people be dumb, right? It is not acceptable for me for these people to be dumb forever, right? And I think that we all are here, right? I visit my parents all the time. I'm happy to go into the Naperville City Council and give them a education on this. I'm doing this for Ohio communities now, right? But the notion for a second that we should say that it's our fault that they are completely uneducated is ridiculous. This is the largest wealth creation opportunity in our lifetime. And the fact that they don't understand it is crazy.
I love the smackdown. And it's a huge frustration for residents in these districts. Huge frustration.
You mean the people who live in rural co-ops?
Yes.
You know that no one votes in rural co-op elections. I'm one of the larger sort of investors in rural co-op election cycles. They constantly just re-elect the same old people onto the boards. There's like 637 people that vote. If people wanted change, they could just vote. It only takes 600 people to actually vote these people out of office and put in progressive people on those boards. I'm sorry, Tim, but I am tired of making excuses for the people who live there and the people who govern there, right? We have all these programs that are not available to the East and West Coast. They're not available to urban centers. They're only available to small municipal utilities and rural co-ops. And they're available to cities and towns that have been decimated by manufacturing facilities that have gone under. They have very special programs. They are fully funded and no one asks for the money. The money just sits there unused at USDA. And I'm tired of basically saying to those people, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that we haven't spent millions of dollars lobbying you to do the right thing. I mean, that is just unacceptable. I mean, if you and I can come up with something to solve that problem, I'd love to work with you on it. But I'm not going to make excuses for them.
Well, it seems to me what you're touching on is the fact that our democracy is dysfunctional, highly dysfunctional, and Americans do not trust government, and Americans are, for the most part, not engaged in government. And utilities, for all intents and purposes, are perceived as a government entity, even though they are private or quasi-private entities. So let's get to some other questions. We have a question about taxes versus subsidies. I know you're not a fan of carbon taxes.
Yeah.
What about just, when you say ratepayers, well, the REC program is paid for by ratepayers in Illinois.
That's right.
I think that's a great solution. We want to double that cap. It's currently capped at 2%, I think. We want to double that. And that would free up a lot of resources for solar and wind.
Yeah, sure. I mean, carbon taxes, let's be clear, right? The most successful carbon tax in North America is in British Columbia. At best, it'll reduce carbon emissions by 1.5% to 2% a year, right? So they don't work. I'm not suggesting you shouldn't do it. You should do carbon taxes at a minuscule level just to make sure that everyone actually has to forced to be doing the carbon accounting of what their businesses produce, right? So maybe that's useful. But I don't think that carbon taxes are a magic solution. What has worked in most places is sectoral policy, right? So one set of policies for transportation, one set of policies for electricity, one set of policies for natural gas, one set of policies for farming, right? We should be paying farmers to adopt different farming practices and to make sure that their soil carbon goes from close to 0% today to 10% where it's healthy. And in fact, at 10%, there's all sorts of co-benefits like less flooding because the soil can contain more water. There's lots of benefits to having the farmers, like retain more carbon in their soils. And, the state could pay for that. And so I think there's lots of things that we can do, but I think we have to acknowledge that where we are headed right now is a place where Illinois is going to be Chicago and the Chicago suburbs, and then the rest of the state, which basically has been going sideways for the better part of 30 years, right? And I think that, part of what the governor's office has to do is to figure out how we actually deliberately invest into the rural parts of the state. And we haven't been doing that well. And there are lots of programs like the soil carbon stuff, for instance. There was a $25 million study budget in the last USDA farm bill. And that budget has shown that for less than $20 a ton, farmers can actually pursue no-till practices, pursue cover crops, do a lot of the things that would actually retain soil in the ground. There are companies like Indigo Ag, Nori, and even Monsanto Bayer have come up with their own soil carbon programs, right? And the governor's office is not pushing that to Illinois residents, Illinois farmers. And so I think there are a lot of programs that we could be doing here, but I think that it requires a level of leadership that frankly we haven't seen out of the state of Illinois in a long time.
Well, the people on this call are leaders or future leaders, and while we are a minority, there is, I think, a next generation of leaders coming. So don't give up on us.
I will never give up on Illinois. You know that. I mean, I won't ever give up. My parents still live in Illinois. It's not about giving up, right? It's about, like in religious teachings, it's sort of like, the good Lord sort of, helps those who help themselves. And, my sense is that here Like Illinois has to meet all of these folks halfway. I mean, like, we see another clean energy book every month, right? I mean, in Illinois, Hari Lamba just published his new book, right? And it's a great book. It has like a step-by-step approach to how to decarbonize the planet and Illinois. But is anyone reading it? Probably not. And then they're complaining to me about how they don't have any resources when you have a guy in your state who's published a book on how to do it. I mean, I just think that we're in a situation where there are all these experts, there are all these people who are pouring out their heart and soul into blogs and other places. And, folks aren't reading it, right? And folks are not using that expertise that are already in their home states, right? And so I'm happy to do whatever it takes to support the good citizens of Illinois, but I do think that they have to recognize that Illinois is blessed. I mean, it is more blessed than almost any other place in the country, with some of the smartest people, one of the best university systems in the world, the most beneficial natural resources, from access to Lake Michigan to all the rivers and to the Mississippi River to farmers, right? And it's high time they start using those resources to bring wealth creation to its citizens.
So could you, for our listeners, tell us the name of that book? Do you know? I looked on Amazon. I couldn't find it. How do you spell Hari Ramba, first of all?
It's HARILAMBA.
Lamba, got it.
Yeah, and his book is Brighter Climate Future.
Thank you. So our friend Ty Newell asks, Jigar, what are your thoughts on rooftop solar versus utility scale solar from a standpoint of maintaining a level of negotiating leverage on the part of the consumer?
Well, this is the part where the democracy part really comes in, right? I mean, it is fine to say that from an engineering standpoint that large utility scale solar is cheaper than rooftop solar. But from the perspective of tornadoes that are getting worse, right? From the perspective of grid disruptions that are getting worse, there are a lot of people out there who want to buy a diesel generator for backup for their house. That's expensive. As you know, paying Generac or those people to do that, super expensive. It's a lot cheaper for them to put solar on their roof, a battery storage unit in their garage, and to hook up their electric vehicle also to do vehicle to grid for their home, right? And it's one of those things where people are saying, well, but utility scale solar is cheaper. I was like, well, but if consumers are paying money for diesel generators or natural gas generators as backup because they're so disgusted by the service that they're getting from the utility, that's money that's leaking out of the utility system. Those are people who are willing to pay a premium for reliable power that are not being allowed to plug into the broader system, right? And I think that is the reason why rooftop solar matters so much compared to utility scale solar, and there needs to be a balance between both.
Yeah, I think to the credit of the IPA, the program that we have, the block program, is fairly well balanced. There's 50-50 right now, DG and utility. And that seems like a reasonable balance. I don't know what Ty Newell thinks about that, but or what he's driving at there. I guess he perceives some inequity. I want to move on to Andy's question from Urbana-Champaign. The UC Solar Group Buy program with the Geothermal Group Buy program. Urbana is following on the UC Solar Buy program with the Geothermal Group Buy.
Yeah.
What hurdles should we consider for homeowners to electrify their HVAC? Most homes are cheap natural gas, but there are rural propane areas.
Yeah, I think that geothermal benefits far more from these buying co-ops than even solar does, right? I mean, with solar, there's some efficiency around being able to do 2 homes a day instead of 1 home a day, and the bucket truck or whatever that you're renting. But in geothermal, right, there's a specialty rig that you're renting, and dispatching that rig is pretty expensive. And so it could cost $30,000 to do a geothermal system at a home. But if you do it at a buying pool, Dandelion and some of these other companies who've been doing this in New York have shown that you can get the cost down to $16,000 a house if you can actually, get a sufficiently large buying co-op. And then the question in terms of cost is really more about finding people who are at the end of life for their existing technology. Clearly, for people who are using propane or, in the worst case scenario, fuel oil, are going to be cost effective in any case. But for the folks who are using natural gas, if they're at the end of life on their furnace and they need to buy a new one anyway, you could be quite cost effective to switch to geothermal at that point, even if you're on natural gas.
Yeah, it seems like geothermal has fallen on tough times here in the Midwest. I don't know if you see other success stories around the Midwest for geothermal.
Well, I mean, geothermal energy, meaning large scale utility, or you're talking about geothermal heat loops for homes?
Distributed, residential.
Yeah, remember that, every time the natural gas utility extends the natural gas grid, it costs a ton of money. And for these rural areas where there's only, 50 people per mile, right? It's not very cost effective for them to build that new infrastructure. We let them do it because that's how we pay off the natural gas utilities. They get paid, natural gas utilities don't make money on the sale of the molecules. They get paid by putting in more infrastructure and rate basing that infrastructure. So you could imagine it's quite cost effective for the natural gas utility to put in geothermal heat pumps for that new subdivision and not outfit it with natural gas in general than it is to hook it up to natural gas at all. Right. And this is, again, where state regulators have to start doing more math, right? As Bill Clinton said, arithmetic, and start looking at this and saying, instead of blindly rate basing the extension of that natural gas pipeline, we think it's actually more cost effective for you, the natural gas utility, to put in these geothermal heat pumps for free and rate base it, right? And then just charge the customers what they would have paid under natural gas, right? Under the same tariffs. And over 30 years, they're going to, make a healthy rate of return. And so I think that this is where the electrify everything movement is going. And that's, I think, critical. But it requires people to do real arithmetic. It's not, in general, I'd say a lot of this stuff is failing because people are doing exactly what their, grandparents did, right? They're not innovating in infrastructure.
Yep. I want to talk about electrification. We only have about 10 minutes left, so
Sure.
Our listeners should get their questions in. And the good news is that, again, our governor has put a stake in the ground saying Illinois is going to become a leader in electrification infrastructure, speaking to transportation. We have Rivian in Illinois and Bloomington Normal with a big factory that hopefully soon, crossing fingers, will start pumping out some EVs on par with Tesla. And but where do you see leadership in the Midwest around electrification of transportation and other infrastructure?
So remember, I think that people start getting super obsessed about like fast chargers and all sorts of other stuff in the vast majority of Illinois, right? Not Chicago, but the vast majority of the geographical space in Illinois, people have dedicated places to charge. And it's actually quite easy for them to charge at 110 volts. And it's actually not that hard to hook them up to a washer and dryer port at 220. And so, that is more than sufficient for almost everyone. Like I'm funding EVs for Uber and Lyft drivers who drive 200 miles a day. They are charging on level 2 charging at home. They are not charging on fast chargers. So let's dispense with the need for fast chargers. There will be a couple of fast chargers that we should put at every, rest stop. We should put a couple of fast chargers in at gas stations. We should put a couple of fast chargers in other places. But EVs and the EV transition will happen purely on level 2 chargers. So I think that part is fine. And the utilities are happy to rate base level 2 charger installations in people's homes. I think the big problem is trying to get people to understand that I mean, the average person in Illinois, right, particularly in the rural areas, like not in downtown Chicago, owns 3 cars for 2 people, for 2 drivers, right? A lot of people own extra cars in Illinois. And we need one of those cars, not all of them, one of those cars to be EV. And what you find, every study shows that once you have an EV in the house, everyone magically recognizes that that EV is cheaper to drive than the gasoline powered car. So they shift 75% of their miles to that electric vehicle and away from the gasoline powered vehicle. That's what we need. And so the support program needs to be that. And the key to that is allowing people to get access to EVs 1 month at a time, right? So it's not about test drives. It's about saying, look, for $600, you could rent an EV, use it for a month, and if it works for you, great. If it doesn't work for you, you just give it back to us, right? And that's something the utilities could subsidize tomorrow. And in fact, Exelon had this program called Steer, which I think has gotten some outside money in recently, so they could provide that to their communities.
You'd think
quickly.
if you were selling electricity, you would want to catalyze electrification of transportation, because that's a huge opportunity to sell more power.
Totally.
But again, it takes leadership from the governor's office and Springfield in order to really get this infrastructure out on the street.
Right.
So we have just a couple of minutes left, but Jigar, what else would you like to talk about around the Midwest? This is a great opportunity for you to put a stake in the ground and make a wake up call. I hear your frustration, but I also hear your passion and dedication, and I thank you for that. It's heady days. I see a lot of utility scale solar and wind happening in the Midwest. I don't see a lot of DG solar. We are hunting and pecking for good DG opportunities around the Midwest, and they are few and far between.
Well, so what I would say is that the opportunities are endless, right? I'm happy to come on this show anytime to try to, help educate people on what's possible. And we can dig deeper into any of the things that I suggested, whether it's the use of the USDA REAP program or the things. I think that in general, what we need is more entrepreneurship in the state. And the reason we don't have it is because people are willing to starve for a year, but they're not willing to starve for 5 years. And so when someone decides that they're going to quit their job and work closely with their mayor or their county or whatever it is to get something unlocked, they need to see progress within that year. And if they don't see progress in that year, then they starve, right? And too many people have been starving in the Midwest. They haven't been able to get their elected officials to respond to the clear economic signal that's being provided by all these solutions. And that's a big problem. And I think we can say, well, we're not educating people enough and there needs to be more working groups and all that stuff. But part of this is actually just saying to them, why do you hate the county that you manage? Why do you hate the people who live here? Why do you not want to tap into the largest wealth creation opportunity of our lifetime? Why are you ceding that opportunity to the county next door? And I just think that people are not talking in plain English. This has real implications to whether the children who live in that county are going to be able to stay in that county or whether they're going to continue to have massive brain drain into other parts of the country, right? Like people need, like substantive work. They need careers, right? And most of the people that I went to high school with never established a career in the town of Sterling, Illinois, ever. And that's sad, right? And I just think that it's important for us to recognize that this transition is not going to be easy, particularly in places like suburban, exurban, and rural Illinois. But it is possible. And, folks like me are happy to continue to come back and go into great detail on how a lot of this stuff happens. But it's not going to happen because we present a good idea that, pencils on paper. It's going to happen because there's enormous amounts of public pressure from the people who live there.
That's, I mean, I totally agree, but changing the culture of small town America is, it seems to me, even a greater challenge than some of the other challenges we face economically.
Well, but that
Um,
hasn't been true in Texas. It hasn't been true in, Arkansas, Iowa. It's largely only true in Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, Indiana. I'd say
so
the rest,
what's happening in Texas that you are excited about?
the small towns in West Texas make way more money on wind power than they ever made on oil and gas. Right? I mean, wind power is financing the entire school districts in most of those towns. Right? Like, I mean, like this is a real economic deal, right? I mean, they're saying, great, here you can use all this land, which we don't find to be productive anyway from a tax-based perspective. And in exchange, fund our entire school district. And the solar industry is happy to do that.
Yeah,
Right? Like, I mean,
and that's
that deal is getting cut.
and that's happening in fits and starts here in the Midwest, both with wind and solar. But that's not a that's not something that doesn't happen here. See,
Well, I
it's
would say it's not happening there
when the
because
when
you're
the
talking,
developers come, the landowners sign leases. It is more lucrative to sign a solar lease than it is to continue to farm corn and
right.
beans.
But what we're talking about is not about individual commerce. That is happening in all 50 states. We're talking about figuring out how a mayor and an elected official uses the proprietary tools that they have to their advantage to make it happen faster in their community than the community next door. And that is not happening. When you go as a developer to sign a lease and then you go to the mayor to get a permit, they say, great, pay $57,600 right here and you'll get your permit. That's happening. But actually figuring out how to get the mayors to say, we are going to spend our time and the proprietary tools that we have access to make this happen faster is not happening. But that is happening in West Texas.
Okay, I want to drill down on that.
Let's
No
do
pun
it.
intended.
Another podcast. Let's do it.
Yes, indeed. We'll have to have you back. I need to make a couple of announcements, and I'm going to share my screen here. So we have some great events coming up later this month. Risk mitigation for utility scale solar projects with Kimberly Centera of TerraPro Solutions. If you're a solar or wind developer, you want to know Kimberly Centera. She and her colleagues are amazing at de-risking large-scale solar and wind. I'm going to hear about that on October 27th. And then in November, we have PVEL coming on again with the PV inverter and battery storage scorecard with Michael Mills Price. He is an engineer, he's a patent holder, he's the real deal, and we're going to learn more about what PVEL is doing, again, to de-risk the PV industry. So thank you to those two speakers. Jigar Shah, I want to thank you again for coming on the show. Maybe we could do something face-to-face when you come visit your parents.
I would love to. That'd be my pleasure.
Awesome. We'll make that happen. Well, thanks everybody for listening. I'm Tim Montague, your host. Let's grow solar. Thanks, Jigar.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.